Hello dear friends, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is another daily battlefield report from the Ukrainian front. Once again, I would like to congratulate all of you on the new year that has begun. From the bottom of my heart, I wish that in the new year all your plans come true, your goals are achieved, and that this year brings as many positive events and good news as possible. Unfortunately, we are welcoming the new year amid ongoing hostilities. Fighting along the front line has not stopped, which means we continue to closely monitor what is happening and analyze the current situation. The year has only just begun, and I am already at work. Since the new year has arrived but the war has not gone anywhere, we need to discuss prospects. Today, I propose to talk about what can be expected from the new year at the front, in which directions events are likely to develop, which cities the Russian army may be able to take under control by the end of 2026, and which will most likely remain outside the control zone. In other words, today's discussion will be devoted to expectations and forecasts for the coming year. So let us begin. We will start with Sumy Oblast. I will immediately state my position. In 2026, even if hostilities continue throughout the entire year, there will be no large-scale offensive directly against the city of Sumy. Let me explain why I believe this. This sector is the responsibility of the North grouping. At the same time, in addition to Sumy Oblast, this grouping is also actively operating in the north of Kharkiv Oblast. It is precisely the northern part of Kharkiv Oblast that is currently the priority direction. As a result, comparatively limited forces are engaged on the Sumy axis, and apparently they will not be significantly reinforced, at least not to the extent required for a full-scale offensive on Sumy. Here, the Russian army will advance slowly and cautiously, using the forces that are already available. However, even under such conditions, in my opinion, these forces will be sufficient not only to hold current positions and conduct defensive operations, but also to advance gradually. Ultimately, by the end of 2026, Russian units will most likely be able to fully reach and secure the Khotin-Krapovshchina line. A deeper advance is also possible, but with a high degree of confidence, the Russian army will not reach Sumy itself. Therefore, in my view, it makes little sense to seriously discuss the capture of Sumy in 2026. In addition, in certain areas, the Russian army will most likely form local bridgeheads, similar to what we are currently observing on the Krasnopilia sector. Such actions are aimed at stretching Ukrainian forces and depriving them of the ability to conduct effective counterattacks. On the other hand, in the north of Kharkiv Oblast, I see quite serious prospects, especially given how Ukrainian defenses in this sector have recently begun to weaken. If hostilities continue throughout all of 2026, and I am forced to constantly make this caveat, since in the current situation a wide range of scenarios is possible and there is no shortage of black swans, then at the very least we will see the Volchansk and Mylov sectors of the front link up. We are talking about a line from Vilcha toward Bilyi Kolodiaz, then Petropavlivka, Novoalexandrivka, Prikolotne, and Katny. This entire northern sector will ultimately also come under Russian control, because the Ukrainian armed forces will essentially have no alternatives left, either withdrawal or remaining under blockade. In addition, an advance to the south along the course of the Siversky Donetsk River will undoubtedly continue. However, it is difficult to predict exactly which lines can be reached here. Ideally, the offensive should proceed in parallel along both the western and eastern banks of the river. But at the moment the Russian army is facing difficulties specifically on the western bank. The front in the Zaporizhia area remains largely static. Russian units will most likely reach Buhavka, but further advancement remains an open question. The same applies to Veliki Burluk. Will it be possible to reach it within 1 year? Under the most optimistic scenario, yes, it could be taken in 2026. However, I try to set both myself and you, as my audience, toward a more restrained, pessimistic scenario. This helps avoid disappointment that arises from overly high expectations that do not materialize in practice. Therefore, with regard to Veliki Burluk, my forecast is as follows. Most likely the Russian army will not take it in 2026. As for Kharkiv, this is another question I am often asked. Will there be an offensive against Kharkiv in 2026? My answer is unequivocal, no, with 100% certainty. This is already a prospect for 2027, provided that hostilities do not end in 2026. In my view, it is precisely by 2027 that the necessary groundwork for such an offensive will be created. Now let us turn to the difficult sector around Kupiansk and on the left bank of the Oskil River. The year 2026 will most likely become the year in which the entire Ukrainian bridgehead on the left bank of the river is eliminated. This, in turn, will ensure reliable and stable control over Kupiansk itself. In other words, by the end of 2026, this entire problematic sector should be fully cleared. On the right bank, a so-called balcony with established and protected logistics will most likely be formed. By this I mean reaching, for example, the area of Husinka. Once the line of contact is pushed as far away from the Oskil as possible and normal supply across the river is ensured, this balcony can then be used for further actions in the Kupiansk direction. Thus, to sum up, it can be said that 2026 will once again become a year of fierce fighting for Kupiansk. Such is the objective reality of this difficult section of the front. As for the Borova direction, by the end of 2026, Borova will, with a high degree of probability, be taken. Under favorable conditions, it may also be possible to completely clear and take control of the entire left bank. Under the most optimistic scenario, Russian units could even reach the approaches to Izium, in the area of the settlement of Oskil, specifically the settlement, not the river. However, this immediately raises the issue of crossing a water obstacle. Undoubtedly, approaching Izium from the Kupiansk direction would be more logical. But as we have already discussed, there are currently no conditions in place there to carry out such complex tasks. We now move on to Donetsk oblast, and this is where the forecast becomes truly interesting. Will Lyman be taken in 2026? Yes, the probability of this is 99.9%. Will Mykolaiv be taken? Yes, I estimate the probability at around 80%. As for Sloviansk, there are chances of its capture, but if we are honest and objective, they are not very high. The Russian army will undoubtedly reach the city. It is possible that by the end of the year, fighting for the city itself will even begin, but establishing full control over Sloviansk by the end of 2026 seems unlikely. A similar situation applies to Kramatorsk. By contrast, Kostiantynivka, in my opinion, will be taken with a probability of 99.9%. Druzhkivka will also come under control, with the probability here estimated at around 85–90%. Belitske will be taken almost certainly, with a probability of 99.9%. The same applies to Dobropilya and Bilozerske. As a result, in Donetsk Oblast in 2026, 7 cities will, with a high degree of probability, come under Russian control. There remain 3 cities whose fate is still in question. First and foremost, this is Sviatohirsk. The chances of its capture by the end of the year also cannot be called low, given that fighting is currently underway for the urban-type settlement of Yarova. However, the problem with Sviatohirsk lies in its geographical position. From the directions from which the Russian army is currently conducting its offensive, it is impossible to take the city, because on the opposite bank there are significant elevations where the Lavra is located. Until these heights are taken under control, there can be no talk of controlling the city itself. At the same time, at present, the Russian army is not even making active attempts to advance on these heights. That is precisely why I set Sviatohirsk aside. The chances exist, but they are nowhere near 80 or 90%. And finally, the most powerful agglomeration, whose fate also remains uncertain, is Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. No matter how much some might wish otherwise, if we speak purely in military terms, the most likely time frame for their capture is the summer of 2027. In other words, there are still roughly a year and a half left before the active phase of fighting in Donetsk Oblast is completed. Now about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In 2026, Mezhova will be taken. Of this, I have absolutely no doubts. Pokrovska will also be taken. It is possible that Russian forces will reach the approaches to Vasilkivka. However, there will be no rapid thrusts toward Pavlohrad or Dnipro, which are sometimes written and talked about. I see such forecasts quite seriously being circulated, but I consider them unrealistic. The tasks of the Vostok grouping for 2026 are entirely different. The focus is not on Pavlohrad and not on Dnipro. The main objective is to reach Zaporizhia from the eastern direction. That is exactly what the units will be engaged in. And I am confident that by the end of 2026, with a probability of 70–80%, the Vostok grouping, having linked up with the Dnipro grouping, will already be in the area of the airport, in the Lezhin area. That is, just 2 to 3 kilometers from the city. At the same time, during 2026, Kharkiv will be taken with a probability of 99.9%. Vasinivka will also most likely come under control. Summing up Zaporizhia oblast, in 2026, Ukraine's control over this region will be significantly reduced. There will no longer be any talk of a freeze along the current line of contact here. Even if negotiations are conducted, and they will undoubtedly proceed in parallel with combat operations, in a situation where the Russian army is, conditionally speaking, 5 kilometers from Zaporizhia, no one will fix the front line in this region. What remains? Kherson Oblast. Here my forecast is as follows. In 2026, we will most likely see an attempt to create a bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnipro River. Whether this operation can be carried out successfully and whether it will be possible to consolidate, there is an open question. Crossing water obstacles is always an extremely difficult task, especially under modern conditions saturated with drones. However, given the serious weakening of the Ukrainian grouping on the right bank, such an operation looks quite logical and almost inevitable. Overall, this is exactly how I see the situation at the front, developing in 2026, of course, provided that hostilities continue throughout the entire year. During this period, approximately 9 to 10 cities could come under Russian control. The greatest successes for the Russian army, and accordingly the greatest territorial losses for Ukraine, will occur in Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts. The smallest changes along the front line and the smallest territorial losses for the Ukrainian armed forces are expected in Kherson and Sumy oblasts. At the same time, serious problems will be created for the Ukrainian side in Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. This is roughly how I see the picture for the coming year. We continue to closely monitor developments along the entire line of contact. After Russian forces established control over Mirnohrad and Huliaipol, pressure continues on other sections of the front as well. Let us begin the review with changes on the map. As of today, they have been recorded on the Kharkiv direction and in the area of the settlement of Stepnohirsk. Despite statements about full control over Stepnohirsk, the situation there remains ambiguous. In the northern part of the settlement, according to available information, there is still a presence of scattered Ukrainian armed forces units. At the same time, there are video materials and confirmed data indicating an advance by Russian forces. The western part of Stepnohirsk is under confident control of Russian troops. An expansion of the control zone of approximately 400 meters has been recorded here, as well as a further advance of about 200 meters to the north. The previously marked section of combat operations has fully come under the control of the Russian armed forces, which is confirmed by video materials. It is likely that the actual control zone is already wider, given delays in the arrival of confirming data. Overall, it can be said that the settlement is largely under Russian control. Pressure is also continuing in the direction of Lukianivska, which pro-Russian sources consider to be under Russian control. Pressure is also being applied toward Magdalinivka, Novoyakivlivka, and Pavlivka, although there is still no visual confirmation of advances there. Weather conditions are having a significant impact on the situation. We move on to the Kharkiv area. Here, local changes in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces have been recorded, but active combat operations continue in the area of Novodanilivka. Russian forces continue to strike Ukrainian positions in the areas of Novoandriivka and Malotokmachka. At present, Novodanilivka is largely under Ukrainian control, with no Russian units present within the settlement itself. At the same time, the Ukrainian side has not been able to firmly entrench there. A similar situation is developing in Malotokmachka, where Ukrainian assault groups are regularly destroyed by Russian FPV drone teams. The Russian side has officially acknowledged leaving Novodanilivka under Ukrainian control. On the Huliaipol direction, Russian forces are conducting a regrouping, clearing adjacent territories, and expanding their zone of control. Russian positions are regularly struck by FPV drones. In the area of Zaliznikne, elite Ukrainian units are operating, periodically launching counterattacks, but without notable results. Russian forces have cleared the pocket up to the supply road south of Huliaipol. All marked territory has come under their control, as confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. At present, Russian units are advancing towards Zaliznikne, where Ukrainian forces lack serious fortified positions. The Ukrainian line of fortifications lies further on and represents the next line of defense. Airstrikes have also been recorded against temporary deployment points of the Ukrainian armed forces in the areas of Barvinivka, Lyubetska, and Dolinka. Weather conditions limit the active use of FPV drones, so the volume of news from this sector is relatively small. Active combat operations continue in the areas of Pryluki and Varvarivka. Earlier, Ukrainian forces attempted counterattacks towards Sladka and Rivnopilia, but they failed both to reach these settlements and to consolidate there. 2 armored columns and the infantry that followed were destroyed, resulting in serious losses for the Ukrainian side. At present, Russian forces are exerting pressure on Ukrainian positions in the Pryluki area and are conducting active combat operations in the Dobropilia area. Varvarivka remains under Russian control, as confirmed by numerous video materials. From the Dnipro direction, no significant news has been reported. Russian forces are striking Ukrainian positions in the areas of Oleksandrivka, Dobropasove, and Bratske. The settlement of Herasimivka remains in a grey zone after the map was corrected in favor of the Ukrainian side, while Russian units were forced to pull back slightly. On the Pokrovsk direction, active combat operations continue in the area of Rishine. Ukrainian forces are attempting counterattacks, but no expansion of the control zone has been recorded. Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad are under full Russian control, and demining and clearance operations continue in the cities. On the Dobropilia salient, changes have been recorded in the area of Novashakova, which has come under full control of the Russian armed forces. Strikes are also being carried out against Ukrainian positions in the area of Volna. An attempted counterattack by Ukrainian forces towards Suvorov and Zatishok was thwarted, and the entire group was destroyed by FPV drone teams. On the Kostiantynivka direction, the situation remains unchanged. Active combat operations continue without noticeable advances by either side. On the Siversk direction, Russian forces are exerting pressure towards Zakotne. According to a number of reports, the settlement has effectively come under Russian control and clearance operations are underway there, but confirmations are still insufficient to make changes on the map.